So today's lecture is on Reconstruction, and it's a big topic and a pretty important one, but I'll try to not make this too long. The chapter is really good, and I think one of the stronger chapters in this textbook, so make sure you've read it and read it pretty carefully. I think the key things to look for as you read are, obviously what Reconstruction was. Make sure you have a pretty good grasp of that, and the differences between the Reconstruction plans. And usually we talk about Congressional Reconstruction led by radical Republicans, those who were abolitionists before the Civil War and really kept the focus on emancipation and improving the lives of the freedmen after the war, and then presidential reconstruction, which initially is Abraham Lincoln, but obviously very quickly at the end of the war passes to his vice president, his new vice president, Andrew Johnson, a former Democrat and Southerner from Tennessee, who has a very different idea of what Reconstruction should look like than the Republicans from New England and Pennsylvania and New York that are leading Congress. And so understand the difference between those two plans is pretty important. And then um, evaluating its success. Was Reconstruction a success? Was it a failure? Why? And maybe it's more complicated than that. Was it successful in some ways? Was it successful for a certain amount of time before it then became a failure? But evaluating the successes and failures is pretty important. For a long time, really up through the 1960s, so for almost 100 years after the Civil War, most Americans, at least most white Americans, viewed Reconstruction as a disaster and a failure of epic proportions. And there was a lot of racism, behind that evaluation that basically blamed Black Americans for the failure of Reconstruction, that Black Americans weren't ready for the rights that were granted, and they weren't prepared to become full citizens, was the kind of argument that was made. Um, this was challenged before then by a number of historians, most notably W.E.B. Du Bois, the civil rights leader and historian and sociologist. And Du Bois wrote a book in the 1930s called Black Reconstruction, which is still one of the best works on this period. And he and others argued, that Reconstruction actually was very successful, but it was limited because there wasn't much support politically from white Americans, basically, North or South. And by the early 1870s, white Americans had largely lost interest in the fate of all these freed slaves in the South. And that's when Reconstruction comes to an end, and blacks in the South are sort of left to fend for themselves. And over the course of a couple of decades, their rights are stripped away gradually in some cases, very gradually in some cases, more abruptly, more suddenly in other cases. Um, so that's another key question: is success, failure, why? Also, then the roles played by various groups, including Southern blacks, freedmen, um, in rebuilding the South, in rebuilding their lives after um, slavery has finally come to an end. What role did they play in Reconstruction is very important to understand. And then, as I was kind of getting at, the other thing that I think is very interesting about Reconstruction is simply the historiography. That is, the way that the history of Reconstruction has changed over the decades, and the long accepted and very racist interpretation of the period has gradually come to be replaced with a much different understanding. And the blame for the failures of Reconstruction is no longer certainly placed on the freed slaves, but instead is placed on Southern whites who did everything they could, including violence and murder, terrorism, to make Reconstruction fail, and that's where the blame certainly should lie. The last thing, as by way of introduction here, is to understand the constitutional amendments that come out of Reconstruction. There are three Civil War amendments: the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the Constitution. Basically, 13th Amendment frees the slaves, 14th Amendment gives them citizenship, 15th Amendment gives them the right to vote. Now, if you think about it just even for a second, the 13th Amendment that ended slavery should have done those other two things, right? That once slavery comes to an end, well, then logically, all those people who were formerly enslaved should be citizens. But because that wasn't clear, to many Americans, Congress made it clear by passing the 14th Amendment to the Constitution. And what the 14th Amendment also does then is it shifts citizenship from states to the federal government. So citizenship becomes national. States can't decide citizenship for Americans any longer after the 14th Amendment. It's now a national question of citizenship, not states. That means states can't infringe upon the rights of U.S. citizens the way they had, especially in the South, especially with African Americans up until that point. Now that's according to the law. Obviously, in practice, sometimes it's a different thing. But at least now there's in the Constitution some clarity regarding citizenship. Even then, Congress felt that there had to be something clearly in the Constitution that would hold up to challenges then in courts that would protect the rights of Black men to cast votes in elections. There's a lot of disappointment amongst women who had been campaigning for the right to vote for a very long time in the United States, that the 15th Amendment did not include the right to vote for women, obviously, and that would take more than another half century before that's finally enshrined in the Constitution. But at least there's some movement forward here with the 15th Amendment granting Black men the right to vote, and that's pretty dramatic because just a few years before, hardly anybody, any white American, was considering extending suffrage to African American men. But again, as we've talked about a little bit already, the experience of the Civil War and the participation, the sacrifices made by Black soldiers, Black men fighting in that war helped to change a lot of minds. Prominently, of course, Abraham Lincoln, but not just at the top, but throughout American society. So that there's actually considerable support by the end of the war and in the years after for African American suffrage. Not in the South, obviously, and in the South, African American men will soon be denied the right to vote through extra legal means, as I said, including extraordinary violence, certainly. But the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments are the Civil War amendments, and constitutional amendments tend to come in groups in American history. There's these periods of intense reform, and the Civil War is one of these. The Civil War and Reconstruction period is a period of reform, right? Radical changes to American society take place in that period, and the constitutional amendments come out of that. A little bit more than a half century later, you're going to see a similar period of intense reform with the progressive era at the beginning of the 20th century. That's when women's suffrage will pass, as well as a host of other constitutional amendments that we'll come back to later in the course. But again, the constitutional amendments don't just kind of happen regularly. They happen in clusters when there's this intensive period of reform in American history. All right, so we talked about already, the end of the war and the assassination of Abraham Lincoln occurring at basically the same time. John Wilkes Booth, the assassin, is quickly caught and shot to death in a burning barn in Virginia, but three of his collaborators are hanged, and and that sort of puts that story to rest. And then America has to deal with the problem of Reconstruction, and um, Reconstruction, in some senses, is literally how do you rebuild all these war-ravaged areas in the South. Military victory brought all these new responsibilities of governance, which are often more challenging than winning the battles themselves. Um, we've seen this in our recent past in Afghanistan and Iraq, for example. And the U.S. Constitution was no help here. There's no guidance for how to deal with states that left the Union, that seceded by choice, and then were reintegrated into the Union by force. So the question in 1865 was, what do you do with these southern states? They're populated with all these people who had fought against the United States, plus these emancipated slaves, plus their masters, their former owners. How do you integrate all these people as U.S. citizens back into the United States? And then what about the debt? What about the money? Southern states had incurred all sorts of debt in order to fight against the United States. Who should pay back those debts? Should the United States pay the South's debts when that money was used to fight against the U.S.? Who should pay to rebuild this region that was destroyed in war? Should Northerners pay to rebuild? Should Southerners pay? How would this possibly work? And what do you do with these 4 million former slaves? These are really unanswerable questions to a large extent, and and certainly the United States fails to come up with satisfactory answers to any of those questions. So I already talked about the critiques of Reconstruction a bit. So like I said, since the 1960s, the view has really changed, and since the Civil Rights Movement, we understand much better that black rule was limited in the South. So unlike that earlier, more racist interpretation of Reconstruction, which said, well, blacks unprepared for political life were all of a sudden thrust into positions of power, and they really made a mess of things. Well, in fact, there weren't very many black men who managed to secure political power during Reconstruction, very few, in fact. And where it did come to happen, where it did come to pass, politics was far less corrupt than white rule had been, certainly, and white rule was in that period that we call the Gilded Age. Radical Republicans in Congress were mostly acting to preserve the fruits of the war effort, to protect the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the Constitution in particular. The KKK, the Ku Klux Klan, which again in this earlier view had been portrayed as this heroic band of knights who were trying to preserve law and order across the South. We understand them now, certainly, to be a terrorist organization, pure and simple. The carpetbaggers, these Northerners who went to the South and were ridiculed for many decades by Southerners and ultimately across the country as Northerners who were trying to go south and just exploit this impoverished region. Most of those people actually who went south were trying to improve the lives of Southerners, and particularly were trying to improve the lives of freedmen, freed people, and were idealists more than they were profiteers. And so we're looking at what Lincoln did first before he's assassinated, and he did come up with a post-war Reconstruction plan. He focused on reuniting the country without punishing the South any further than it had already been punished. He used the phrase "with malice toward none." In his understanding, the war had accomplished that. There had been punishment enough just from the war. So in 1863, Lincoln had issued the Proclamation of Amnesty and Reconstruction. And in that plan, he laid out what would happen to the Southern states after the war. He said that Southern states could form a new government once 10% of the voting population took an oath of allegiance to the Constitution and to the United States, and they had to pledge to support emancipation laws. Later on, that would include the 13th Amendment to the Constitution, but that comes later. Um, Excluded from future elected office, were any high-ranking officers of the Confederacy, military as well as political, and any ex-officials of the United States, political, military, who had resigned in order to serve the Confederacy. They are all banned from holding future office in the United States. But this is the 10% plan that Lincoln introduced. So it's fairly lenient in terms of how states can be readmitted, obviously, and 3 states gained readmittance under this plan. Congress, though, refused to recognize them, and they refused to recognize President Lincoln's authority to even set the terms for readmission. They felt like this was a congressional right and responsibility in their reading of the Constitution. So you have these more radical Republicans than Lincoln in Congress who want to thoroughly transform Southern society. They want to eliminate the planter class, the slave-owning planter class, and they want to make the South look more like the North, with its emphasis on smaller scale capitalism, even though this was already rapidly disappearing in the North and being replaced by large-scale capitalism. They wanted an oath too, but they wanted an oath sworn that so that people said they never supported the Confederacy, and if they couldn't swear to that, then they couldn't rejoin the United States, essentially. Lincoln pocket vetoed that bill, meaning that he just didn't sign it. He didn't veto it, he didn't sign it, so it didn't go anywhere. And then he died, right? And after his assassination, Vice President Andrew Johnson, Democrat, former slave owner himself, takes over the presidency and begins planning Reconstruction himself. Johnson then faced this task without the benefit of having his own party in power in Congress, and so he had an even more difficult time than Lincoln working with radical Republicans in Congress. So Johnson's plan called for very easy readmittance to the Union for the ex-Confederate states, but he wanted to exclude from office holding anybody who owned more than $20,000 worth of property, as Johnson believed that the wealthy of the South had led the South into secession and war, and so he really wanted to destroy that planter class. But he also granted thousands of presidential pardons to that group, meaning that he could kind of pick favorites and decide who was going to be pardoned and who wouldn't. Johnson also called for a native, local Unionist governor to be appointed in each state, and then each state had to renounce secession forever. They had to abolish slavery. They had to repudiate all Confederate debts, that is, the U.S. would not pay back those debts, and they had to ratify the 13th Amendment to the Constitution. Both Lincoln and Johnson very quietly endorsed the idea of black suffrage, but the leniency of these requirements in the presidential Reconstruction plans meant that Southern states could basically ignore the issue of black suffrage and not really have to think about it or deal with it. Congress and Lincoln had also authorized the creation of this Freedmen's Bureau, this new agency, a relief agency essentially for the South, and a new provider of social services to the freed people. General O.O. Howard was named the first head of the Bureau. Howard University is named after him. He's a man who believed that freedmen needed education, and the freedmen, interestingly, felt the same way. They felt like education was the first priority after having been denied it for so long in the South. And the Freedmen's Bureau, had funded 3,000 new schools across the South by 1870. And this was a region that really hadn't supported public schools at all for whites or blacks before the Civil War. Only the elite really had any education in the South, and everyone else was left in ignorance. So the effects of these Freedmen's Bureau schools are that the literacy rate jumps something like 20%, I think, from like 10 to 30% or so of freed slaves by 1875. Still low, but a pretty remarkable change in just a few years. Most of the teachers at these Freedmen's Bureau schools came from the North. As I said, these are these carpetbaggers that white Southerners see as seeking profit, but really they're mostly there to try to improve the situation. Many of them are missionaries, former missionaries, but same kind of idealism that missionaries have. They're trying to go into a less developed, less civilized area from their perspective and turn it around, make it less backwards. They're interested in uplifting the black race, is how they would have put it, how they would have seen it then. And they were subjected to insults, to violence, to assaults, and treated absolutely terribly, of course, by white Southerners. You have new colleges that are established as well. So in addition to these Freedmen's Bureau schools, there are colleges throughout the Upper South and into the Deep South too. You've got the Hampton Institute in Virginia. You've got Howard, as I said, in Washington, D.C. And they're starting to train black teachers. And so this begins the process of um, um, training a class of teachers who can then pass on what they learn to a new generation of students. It also begins to form a black middle class and a black intellectual class for the first time, really, in American history. You've got a few, isolated black Americans who are able to, against all odds, achieve education earlier. But now we're seeing, many more black Americans finding opportunities to gain education. In the meantime, you have the Black Codes instituted across the South. Now, at the end of the chapter that you're reading, you'll see that one of the documents that's available is an excerpt from Mississippi's Black Codes, and it's really worth looking at. These are really important laws that are put into place right after the Civil War because what they do is they try to essentially re-enslave former slaves. They force them into really unfair labor employment contracts, often with the very same plantation owners that they had served as slaves just a year or two before, um, and they preemptorily strip blacks of their newly won civil rights as well. So they put limits on gun ownership, for example, which is something that happened before the Civil War too. But now, in theory, these free people are supposed to have the same rights, but these black codes are introduced as a way of denying them certain basic rights. And like I said, the labor contracts, the employment contracts are really key here because they'll say things like in the Mississippi codes, for example, that if a black man is stopped and doesn't have the proper papers on him, then he can be jailed. And jailed means he can be set to hard labor, which means he can be then leased out to cotton plantations and forced to work on cotton plantations, essentially as a slave. So convict labor in the South will actually, in many ways, replace slavery and provide a new source of unpaid labor for cotton plantations. And these black codes say that if you don't have a work contract on your person, then you can be thrown in jail if you're black. And these contracts were often unfair. So if you're a black man, you're forced to sign a contract. Otherwise, you're going to be thrown in jail. Then you don't have a lot of options but to sign that contract, even if it's terrible, right? Even if it's terribly unfair, doesn't pay a decent wage, forces you to work in conditions that are dangerous, strips away your basic constitutional rights. If you don't sign that contract and you don't carry that contract on you at all times, then you're in serious jeopardy. So these are obvious violations of the new constitutional rights. And in response to these codes and the fact that the new Southern governments that are forming look pretty much like the old Southern governments, and the same class of people is basically running Southern affairs despite the war, despite the efforts at Reconstruction. This leads the new Republican Congress that met for the first time in 1866 to propose a more radical alternative, and this is Congressional Reconstruction. So, like I said, these are people who had been fighting for abolition for many decades at this point, and they were not at all willing to let the South reinstate slavery under a new name, which is what they saw happening. Um, Radical Republicans then battled Johnson for the next couple of years, and Northern voters also, were increasingly dissatisfied with Andrew Johnson as president and his plan, and they voiced their anger in various ways over Southern white violence toward freed people and towards Republicans and Unionists. And they overwhelmingly support the radical Republicans in the 1866 midterm elections, and so they increased the radicals' position in Congress. Johnson, as president, tries to kill the Freedmen's Bureau. He also vetoes a civil rights bill, which had granted national and state citizenship to native-born blacks, and so this is what led to Congress overriding that veto and then passing the 14th Amendment to the Constitution to make sure that civil rights were actually going to be protected. And I already, went into that, right? So, I want to skip over some of my notes here. So in 1867 then, as Congress is still witnessing the violence in the South, and they're hearing testimony from freed people who come to Washington about the Ku Klux Klan and other white vigilante terrorist groups and their violence in the South. And so in 1867, in the spring, Congress passes 3 new Reconstruction laws. All of them are over Johnson's vetoes. They have to override his vetoes. The Military Reconstruction Act, the Command of Army Act, and the Tenure of Office Act. Briefly, the Military Reconstruction Act divides up the South, except for Tennessee, which had already passed the 14th Amendment and was therefore exempted, into 5 military districts. So these military districts go across state lines. They basically say states' rights are irrelevant here. We're going to rule this territory like an occupied enemy nation. And there are going to be military governors appointed by Congress to rule these 5 military districts. To get out of that, states had to hold constitutional conventions. They had to write completely new state constitutions. All male citizens had to be guaranteed the right to vote under these new constitutions. If these constitutions were approved by the U.S. Congress, then the state could be readmitted finally to the Union. A February 1867 article in The Nation magazine, a magazine that is still with us today, noted how the North had radicalized in these years as a result of events in the South. So this is 1867, remember. So I'll quote, 6 years ago, meaning 1861, the North would have rejoiced to accept any mild restrictions upon the spread of slavery as a final settlement. 4 years ago, the North would have accepted peace upon the basis of gradual emancipation. 2 years ago, the North would have been content with emancipation and equal rights for the colored people without extension of the suffrage, the right to vote. 1 year ago, 1866, a slight extension of the suffrage would have satisfied the North. But by 1867, it was clear that taking these small steps would only result in the South reverting to its old habits, and so instead, the North has moved to a much more radical position than it had held before. So Congress allows 7 southern states to be readmitted in 1868, and the last 3, Mississippi, Texas, and Virginia, were admitted finally in 1870, at which point they also had to ratify the 15th Amendment for suffrage, which had passed in the interim. The 15th Amendment was necessary, as I said, because of the violence that was orchestrated by the KKK and other terrorist groups. Murders and other violence had allowed Southern Democrats to win in the 1866 elections in the southern states, completely disenfranchising black voters as well as white Republican voters in the South. And so the 15th Amendment was an attempt to settle the suffrage question once and for all. Obviously, it doesn't do that because blacks are still going to be denied the right to vote in the South for another 100 years. Radical Republicans are looking for ways to impeach Johnson, to remove him from office. And in August of 1867, Johnson removed Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, longtime Republican leader, and this violated the new Tenure of Office Act that Congress had passed. And so the House votes to impeach Johnson along party lines, 126 to 47, which gives you a sense of how imbalanced Congress was at that point. The Senate tries him, which is how the Constitution sets up impeachment, but came one vote short in the vote to remove him from office. But going through the impeachment trial left Johnson pretty weak politically, and he finishes out his term without challenging Congress on Reconstruction further. So meanwhile, in the South, ex-slaves are trying to rebuild their lives and rebuild families. Former slaves were interested in land ownership, in education. Education was fine, but land ownership led to conflicts with both Southerners and Northerners, so Southern whites and Northern whites. Former slaves were not particularly interested in the wage labor model that Northerners wanted them to adopt. Northerners essentially suggested that the cotton plantations should be revived the way they were before, but instead of slaves, there'd be wage earners picking the cotton. But blacks didn't want to just pick cotton on big plantations anymore. Who would? Nobody wanted to do that. And that was kind of the problem for the Southern economy after the war. And well, I'm going to skip over what I was going to say here. So there's a big question of land redistribution after the Civil War, and there's a lot of confusing things that happen. So one really important case occurs on the Sea Islands off South Carolina in early 1863, where the U.S. government began selling lands that had been left abandoned by former slave owners, former planters, and pooling their resources together. Former slaves there on the Sea Islands managed to buy 2,000 acres altogether. And they showed, anybody who was paying attention that they were more than willing to work as long as it was working for themselves and not for some white planter. And they wanted to grow crops, not cotton. They wanted to grow produce for themselves and for marketing. But no, they weren't interested in picking cotton. Northern investors, as I said, though, who ended up buying a lot of the land in the South, wanted to get ex-slaves to work for wages, and the slaves really were not interested in doing that. And this proved to be a source of frustration for Northerners who expected that black slaves, former slaves, would just be moved into wage labor and still work the same as they had before the war. By the summer of 1865, President Johnson returned the land on the Sea Islands to the former owners, taking it away from the former slaves who had paid for those 2,000 acres. General O. Howard was the unfortunate man who had to deliver the news to the freedmen and asked them to forgive their former masters and return the land to them. One former slave told General Howard, "The man who tied me to a tree and gave me 39 lashes and stripped and flogged my mother and my sister, and who will not let me stay in his empty hut unless I do his planting and be satisfied with his price, and who combines with others to keep away land from me, knowing that I would not have anything to do with him if I had the choice, If I had land of my own, that man I cannot well forgive. Um, and so it's a very sad situation that very quickly after the war, the freed people in the South are learning that white Americans, whether Northerners or Southerners, aren't in fact going to support them in land ownership, and white Americans basically want them to return to their former roles. Um, there are other examples of this kind of situation. The Sea Islands one, I think, is going to have to stand for those for now. Um, in some places, and this will spread fairly rapidly in the decades after the Civil War, freed people work out kind of a compromise with the former planters. Individual black families will work a small plot of land independently, but they will rent that land. They won't own it. They'll rent that land from a larger southern white planter, and they don't have any money to rent the land. So what they do instead is they exchange a share of that year's crop. And so this is where we get the term sharecropping. And by 1870, sharecropping has become the dominant form of black agricultural labor in much of the lower South, at least. In the long run, it doesn't work out very well. The white planters tended to cheat black laborers. They would overcharge them. They would demand ridiculous shares of the crop, and then charge them for seed and machinery and everything else. But in some ways, in the short term, it does work, and it does give freed people a little bit of a sense of independence, which is what they wanted more than almost anything else. Um, all right. Um, Sorry, again, I want to skip over some things. So we do have state conventions across the South after the Civil War, and hundreds of black delegates, um, men, participate in these state conventions. But mostly it's free mulattoes from cities, people who were free before the Civil War, in other words, that played a more prominent role in these conventions than former slaves did. In areas with a larger black population, a black majority, blacks generally felt safe participating in politics. But in other areas of the South where they were the minority, the Klan terrorized the black population and prevented black people from exercising any political rights. Um, Black political influence was exaggerated, as I said, by Southern whites who were demanding a return to all-white rule. And of the state conventions that are held across the South, only one, South Carolina, had a black majority. Louisiana's was fairly equally divided between blacks and whites, but only two other states, Florida and Virginia, had more than 20% black delegates at these state conventions after the war. Not a single black man was elected governor during Reconstruction, although one did serve as governor in Louisiana after the white governor resigned. There were two black U.S. senators during Reconstruction, Hiram Revels and Blanche K. Bruce, as well as 14 U.S. congressmen. And across the South, in the various state legislatures, 600 legislative seats were held by black men. Thousands of black men did serve in local positions, from school boards to sheriffs, and until the 1870s, late 1870s, blacks participated in public life pretty extensively. So, that first decade or so, there's pretty widespread black political and civic participation across the South. And they were able to do things that they'd been prohibited from doing before. They held political meetings without permission from whites. They gathered in public spaces, and walked, in areas that were previously off limits. They stayed on the sidewalks instead of jumping off into the gutters when whites approached. And so freedom, at least in those first few years, meant dignity. It meant having the dignity of everyday life that white Southerners had taken for granted and had denied blacks for so long, and would deny them again very shortly. The independent church becomes the center of black life in Southern communities, and the Baptist Church grows the fastest in the post-Civil War period because of its decentralized and very democratic structure, in which the community, the black community in this case, chooses its minister, conducts church affairs independently of any larger structure, and it becomes the first institution that's really controlled by black men. Um, the The other thing I was going to say, I guess, about Reconstruction is just a quick mention of the actual construction. You have the first extensive rail network in the South built during this period. Public schools, as I said, opened for the first time. All sorts of other institutions that have been prominent features of northern cities for decades at least. Orphanages, asylums, public buildings, bridges, new roads, all these things that had not been funded were now funded by the U.S. government and by northern taxes, northern taxpayers. Um, Unfortunately, much of this happened through corrupt dealings, and which was kind of a feature of the United States, in the late 19th century. And this legitimated some of the Southern complaints about Reconstruction. But really, the corruption was pretty minimal compared to what was going on in states like New York in this period. Um, Southerners, as I said, Southern whites mostly hated Reconstruction because it included blacks in the political system. The KKK is organized in 1866 by former Confederate General Nathan Bedford Forrest in Tennessee. Um, he still has, there are more statues of Nathan Bedford Forrest in Tennessee than there are of any other person in any one state in the Union today. And Forrest's organization spreads all across the South. Klan members rode across the countryside in masks. They spread rumors of black and white Republican crimes. They attacked physically, of course, black and white Republicans. There's a good image in this chapter, towards the end of the chapter, of a Klan attack on a black household that gives you a sense of how they operated, I think, pretty well. Most Klansmen were poor whites, but the middle class also joined the organization. In the Deep South, Republicans basically disappeared by the early 1870s. They were intimidated or murdered or chased out of town. Blacks basically stopped trying to vote. It's too dangerous to try to cast a vote by the early 1870s. Congress did try to deal with this. They enacted the Enforcement Acts in 1870-71. These protected black voters. They outlawed the Ku Klux Klan. President Ulysses Grant, who won in 1868 by pushing for reconciliation, enforced the acts, but not as thoroughly as he might have. He won the election in 1868 by about 300,000 votes, and he received about 500,000 votes from African American voters in 1868. And this is pretty important to Republican Party success throughout the rest of the century. Is the black vote often makes the difference in these national elections. And when Southern whites can limit that black vote, then they have a better chance of electing conservative, in this case, in this time period, Democrats. All right, so I think I'm going to stop here because this is a long video, and we'll come back to how Reconstruction ends when we get into the Gilded Age in the next segment.